A little girl unexpectedly encounters a millionaire whose luxury sedan is stalled and refusing to start. She rushes over to signal and, to her surprise, fixes the vehicle. Before she can say anything, however, she has to make a fast escape, pursued by a group of neighborhood toughs. The following morning, 12 black SUVs line up outside her home, and the tycoon steps out to deliver a single statement that completely transforms both their lives. Uncle Elias's boatyard was right at the water's edge, where the salty waves constantly gnawed at the decaying wooden pilings. The pungent aroma of diesel fuel, mixed with the scent of rust, permeated the air. Lyra knelt on the greasy floor, her ear pressed against the iron hull of an old fishing trawler that was coughing out thick plumes of black exhaust. The engine was wheezing. She gently touched the pressure valve, feeling the inner rhythm like a doctor checking a heartbeat. Lyra subtly turned her wrist, adjusting a loose bolt. The grating screech faded, replaced by a smooth, steady vibration. "She's breathing easy now, Uncle Elias." Elias wiped the sweat from his forehead with a blackened rag. His face was aged, etched with the crow's feet of constant worry. He looked at his 9-year-old niece, then at the bright red notices he pulled from the worn pocket of his work overalls. They were final delinquency warnings. "Lyra, I am so sorry. I promised your mother before she passed that I would take good care of you. I didn't want you to grow up in this foul-smelling, oily shop. I like it here with you. I like getting machines back in working order." The sharp clack-clack of polished leather shoes echoed on the rotten wooden floor of the shop. Cyrus Thorne walked in his tall silhouette, blocking the light from the main entrance. He looked around with contempt, the gold ring on his finger flashing under the dim yellow lights. Cyrus tossed a legal folder onto the oil-stained workbench. "Elias, I didn't come here to hear a sob story. Fishing season is over. Where's my payment?" "Mr. Thorne, the sea has been too rough this season. I just need a little more time to arrange the funds." "Time doesn't bring in money, Elias, but this will." Cyrus pointed a finger at Lyra. He used his ring-adorned finger to tap forcefully on a clause in the document, the one concerning guardianship. "The agreement is clear. If the debt isn't settled on time, I take custody of Lyra. I'll bring the child to the estate. A natural-born talent shouldn't wither away in this broken-down workshop with a weak-willed old man." Elias trembled, his frail hands clutching his shirt front. His self-respect as a man and his affection for his only niece tore him apart. "You can't take her. Lyra is my only family. My sister entrusted her to me before she perished in that unfortunate incident." Cyrus ignored Elias. His gaze was fixed on the complicated turbocharger unit Lyra had just been attending to. Even his most experienced mechanics had been stumped by that power plant. He looked at Lyra as if she were a precious metal deposit. "Look at the way she handled that. 9 years old and working on this. I will train the child my way. She'll be working in modern labs, not fixing these old rusty fishing boats to clear your debt." Lyra didn't speak a word. She stood up straight, positioning herself between Uncle Elias and the unfamiliar man. Her small, oil-stained hand tightly gripped a rusty wrench. This was the only keepsake from her father, the very one he held that fateful day 10 years prior. Lyra's eyes met Cyrus's, cold and resolute. "Uncle Elias will pay off the debt. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home." Cyrus paused at the child's defiance. He was about to take a step toward her when a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. The storm hit, suddenly rattling the sheet metal roof of the shop. Wind whistled through the gaps, spraying salty mist onto their faces. Cyrus huffily turned his back, striding quickly to the waiting luxury car outside. He rolled down the window, pointing a finger at the two of them. "Tomorrow morning, either the money or the child. I'll repossess this yard and put you out on the street if the full amount isn't available." The sedan sped away, leaving behind a white curtain of rain. Elias collapsed onto the floor, burying his face in his hands. "Lyra, I'm so sorry. I'm so inadequate. Your parents must be deeply disappointed in me." Lyra was about to approach her uncle when a loud smash echoed from the coastal road. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of metal being violently wrenched apart, followed by a choked, sputtering series of detonations from a large, failing engine. Lyra jolted, her eyes shining in the workshop's gloom. Without a moment's hesitation, she quickly grabbed her old tool bag, tucked the rusty wrench into her belt, and dashed straight out into the stormy downpour. "Lyra, where are you going?" Uncle Elias's voice was lost to the wind. Lyra ran plunging through muddy puddles, heading directly for the unusual sound that seemed to be a distress signal in the thunderstorm. There, right at the intersection, a massive black shape lay motionless with white smoke pouring out. She knew something highly unusual was waiting for her up ahead. Lyra pushed through the thorny bushes, ignoring the way the dry branches scraped her skin. Her small feet sank deep into the roadside mud, but she didn't slow down. At the crossroads, the sleek black armored SUV lay tilted in a deep ditch. White smoke billowed from the engine compartment, blending with the gray rain. Inside the vehicle, Julian Vance was striking the electronic dashboard. The numbers and warning lights flashed continuously, but the engine was completely silent. Julian pressed the ignition button again, desperation evident in his eyes. "Blast it, this is the worst possible time for a malfunction. Everything will be completely jeopardized if I don't get there on schedule." A sharp tapping on the window startled Julian. He turned astonished to see a small, soaking wet child standing in the pouring rain. Lyra pointed to the hood and made a lifting motion. Julian hesitated for a second, then pressed the release button. He couldn't explain why he trusted a child at that moment. Perhaps it was the strange confidence in her eyes. Lyra squeezed herself into the engine bay. She ignored the hazard labels warning about the high-voltage electrical system flashing red. Lyra pulled the rusty wrench from her belt, using the steel handle to pry off the protective cover of the central controller. Her hands moved swiftly among the tangled mass of wires. "The salt water has worked its way in here. It's corroding your wires, mister." Julian got out of the car, standing under an umbrella next to Lyra. He was stunned as she pulled a broken water pump out of her tool bag. Lyra used her teeth to strip a section of copper wire from the pump's coil, deftly splicing it past a short-circuited sensor. She took an old roll of cloth electrical tape and tightly wrapped the connection with incredible meticulousness. "All set. Start the engine. Beat paddy fiber first." Julian climbed back into the driver's seat, his hand trembling as he pushed the button. The engine roared once powerfully, then settled into a steady vibration. The prior painful grinding was gone. Julian stepped out of the car, standing silently in the rain. This splicing method, the way the cloth tape was wrapped around the copper core, it all carried the hallmark of an old associate. "Where did you pick up this technique, this method? Only one person I ever knew worked like that." Lyra didn't answer. She wiped a streak of grease from her cheek, her eyes fixed on the luxury SUV. Julian pulled a leather wallet from his jacket pocket, opening it to a thick wad of bills. "Take this. You saved me a catastrophic setback. This is your reward for a terrific job." Lyra pushed Julian's hand away. She walked closer to the driver's side door, pointing at the dedicated computer screen displaying the car's oil pressure readings. "I don't need money. Look at this. My Uncle Elias is struggling with this exact diagram on his old boat. You know about machinery. Could you just show me how to correct it?" Julian looked at the screen, then at the child shivering from the cold. He realized this child didn't want money. She was trying to save her uncle's livelihood. A feeling of guilt mixed with admiration washed over Julian. He quickly took a piece of paper, jotting down Elias's shipyard address and a few technical notes. "Very well, I will certainly help your uncle. But for now, you must get home immediately." Suddenly, flashlights cut sharply through the rain from a distance. The heavy sound of a truck engine approached. Lyra started. She recognized those lights. They belonged to Cyrus Thorne's henchmen. "They are looking for me. I need to depart." Lyra turned to run as Cyrus's subordinate's vehicle screeched to a halt beside Julian's SUV. Julian stood still in the rain, his eyes narrowed. Cyrus's people got out, completely ignoring Julian as they spread out, shining their flashlights into every bush as if hunting a valuable commodity. "Where is the child? She couldn't have gotten far in this weather." The tough shouts made Julian shudder. Then he quickly regained his composure. He hurried into the SUV and started the engine. Julian pressed hard on the gas pedal. The armored SUV surged onto the grassy shoulder, its engine roaring, tearing through the rain. The vehicle swerved across the dirt track, leading to the workshop, cutting off two men who were rushing to grab Lyra by the collar. The tires slid in the mud, splashing their clothes. They halted, cursing, and backed away from the blinding headlights. Lyra seized the opportunity, ducked through the decaying wooden fence, and vanished into the darkness of the shipyard. Julian Vance tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the SUV gliding smoothly along the deserted highway toward the city. The rain had stopped, but in his mind, he could still hear the reverberations of the recent event. The vehicle's power plant, which had been almost failing an hour ago, was now operating with bizarre smoothness. Julian glanced down at the dashboard where the oil pressure numbers remained perfectly stable thanks to that length of copper wire and the bit of old cloth tape. That can't be a coincidence. Immediately upon arriving at his estate, Julian didn't change out of his soaking wet attire. He walked straight into his office, tossed his suit jacket onto the sofa, and powered up the server system. "Marcus, wake up. I need you here immediately," Julian said into the phone, his voice cold and precise. 15 minutes later, Marcus appeared groggy but instantly alert when he saw his boss glued to a screen displaying a satellite map of the old boatyard. "Find me everything on an Elias in docking area 4, and also my old associate Cyrus Thorne," Marcus typed furiously. Data streams began scrolling across the screen. Credit reports, transaction history, mortgage loans. Cyrus had been a partner in his project years ago, but an unfortunate incident occurred, leading to them concluding their collaboration and transferring operations. Cyrus went back to this harbor while Julian continued with his ambitions and ventures. "Sir, the situation doesn't look good. This Elias gentleman is deep in debt. The main creditor is a shell financial company connected to Cyrus Thorne. Compound interest, late payment penalties." Julian scanned the figures. He saw a pattern of sophisticated deception disguised as a commercial contract. Cyrus didn't want money, he wanted leverage. He's applying pressure to acquire a person. He wants the child, but why? Julian muttered. A few minutes later, Julian stood up, pacing the room. He looked out the large glass window where the city lights twinkled below. Does Cyrus Thorne think he's the reigning authority at that harbor? Julian turned back, his eyes blazing. He uses intimidation to coerce people, so we'll use the law of a greater power to engage him. The clock struck 4 a.m. Julian hadn't slept a wink. He drained his third cup of black coffee, setting the mug down hard on the marble table. Marcus called the security team. I want 12 SUVs ready by 6 a.m. Mobilize the corporation's best legal counsel to join us. 12 vehicles. Are you planning a confrontation, sir? Marcus's eyes widened. No, I'm going to show him who is in command here. Julian grabbed his overcoat, his expression hardened with determination. I want to create a steel wall that Cyrus Thorne cannot breach. This morning, we are going to collect my new family member. The following morning, just as the sun broke the horizon, the stillness of the poor neighborhood was disrupted. 12 polished black SUVs simultaneously drove onto the dirt track leading to Elias's boatyard. They parked in a long line, surrounding the entrance like an imposing wall of authority. Curious fishermen peered out their windows, whispering amongst themselves. Julian Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, straightened his impeccably tailored suit, and walked directly into the grease-scented workshop. Inside, Elias sat listlessly at his workbench. He jumped up startled as the unfamiliar man entered. Julian placed a thick folder on the table. I haven't come to settle your debt, Elias. I've come for Lyra. This is a special educational sponsorship contract. My corporation will take the child to the city and train her to become a top-tier engineer. In exchange, I will clear all of your outstanding balances with the bank and private creditors. Elias took the paper with trembling hands. He couldn't believe his eyes. The figures listed were enough for him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Why Lyra? She's just a child who enjoys tinkering with machines. She doesn't just tinker with machines. She understands them better than any engineer I pay millions to. You know that to be true. Before Elias could respond, the heavy thud of leather shoes on the floor interrupted the conversation. Cyrus Thorne walked in, followed by two stone-faced lawyers. He tossed a worn-out contract onto Julian's folder. Mr. Vance, you've acted too quickly. In this neighborhood, the law belongs to the one holding the paperwork. Cyrus pointed to Elias's shaky signature at the bottom of the page. Guardianship rights. Elias signed over the child's custody to me if he failed to clear the debt. Any transaction concerning Lyra must go through me. If you want the child, the price isn't clearing this old man's debt. It's a transfer fee paid to me. $10 million. Julian showed no surprise. No. He signaled to his assistant standing behind him. The assistant opened a briefcase, took out another stack of documents, and spread them out before Cyrus. We have audited every single boat repair invoice you issued to Elias over the past 5 years. You inflated the cost of components threefold and charged illegal compound interest. This constitutes commercial fraud and wrongful seizure of assets. I activated an emergency child protection order from the city court this morning. Economic crimes investigators will be highly interested in this stack of papers. Cyrus's face went pale. He stared at the figures highlighted in red on his fraudulent statement. He knew he had lost the legal ground, but the greed and animosity in his eyes didn't lessen. He stepped close to Julian, pretending to negotiate, then leaned in to whisper to the tycoon. Do you think you're rescuing a talent, or are you trying to atone for what happened to Arthur and Sarah all those years ago? Julian froze. The blood in his body felt like ice. Arthur and Sarah, the associates who vanished along with the blueprint years ago. How did he know that he had to protect the daughter of his two dear friends? He clenched his fingers and moved toward Lyra. Without a word, Julian spun around and firmly took Lyra's small hand, which was tucked behind her uncle. He pulled her straight toward the vehicle, disregarding Cyrus's presence. Let's go, Lyra. You cannot stay here for another minute. Cyrus did not pursue them. He stood in the center of the workshop, watching Julian's retreating back with a calculating half smile. His gaze fell upon the rusty wrench that Lyra had dropped in her haste. He bent down, picked it up, and his thumb lightly brushed against a strange crack in the steel handle. Keep the child, Vance. I'll keep this. Elias stood transfixed, watching Julian's vehicle drive away. Julian had offered to take him along, but he shook his head, retreating into the workshop's shadows. He couldn't face Lyra after letting Cyrus manipulate their lives for so long. He watched the car disappear down the road, leaving him alone with a debt that was cleared and a remorse that would never be fully addressed. Could Julian save Lyra from Cyrus Thorne's grasp this time? Comment "Save Lyra" to follow the dramatic escape of the pair. The convoy of black vehicles sped away, leaving the fishing village behind in a hazy drizzle. Lyra sat small in the soft leather seat of the SUV. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching the city's streetlights rush past. Julian Vance sat beside her, constantly checking messages on his tablet, but occasionally glancing at the child. Julian took off his expensive suit jacket and draped it over Lyra's lightly trembling shoulders. "Will Uncle Elias be okay, sir? I cleared all his debts. He chose to remain there. We must respect his choice." "But Mr. Thorne won't let up. I saw his eyes when he picked up my father's wrench." Paintu. Julian fell silent. He looked out the window where the towering Vance Global headquarters began to emerge, bathed in deep blue neon light. Julian clenched his fist. He had waited 10 years to complete this clean energy initiative, partly for the future, and partly because the name of his associate still haunted him every night. The vehicle stopped in the garage beneath the Vance estate. Lyra stepped out, her small feet recoiling as they touched the polished marble floor. The floor was so clean she could see a reflection beneath her. Disc-shaped autonomous robots glided silently along the corridors, picking up every tiny speck of dust and automatically moving aside when a person approached. Lyra took a step back, holding onto Julian's coat. "These things, they don't make engine noises. That is automation technology. Everything here is absolutely precise." Julian led Lyra through long hallways where glass walls separated state-of-the-art laboratories. He used his fingerprint to open a thick steel door. Inside was a secluded testing facility. Rotating 3D scanners and blue light simulation systems illuminated glistening metal components. Lyra stood silent in the room, looking down at her hands. They'd been scrubbed clean of the boatyard grease, looking strangely white and unfamiliar. Julian walked to a large metal block in the center of the room, the experimental thermal reactor. He pressed a button and screens displaying billions of technical parameters scrolled along the wall. "This is the core of the Clean Energy Initiative, but it's unstable. For 10 years, my best engineers and I haven't been able to keep it running for more than 2 hours without overheating." Lyra didn't look at the screens. She walked slowly around the enormous metal block. While Julian was adjusting algorithms on the control panel, Lyra suddenly knelt. She didn't touch any electronic buttons, but pressed her ear against the reactor's casing. Julian froze. The image struck him so forcefully it took his breath away. Lyra closed her eyes, her small hand feeling along the thermal joints. "It's congested on the underside, Uncle Julian. The sensors show everything is normal. Pressure is stable. Machines don't conceal problems, but sensors can be misled. This spot, its rhythm is intermittent. There's an uneven flow inside the secondary shell." Emotion surged, forcing Julian to grab the edge of the desk for support. Lyra's mechanical intuition wasn't something learned from books. It was the incredible insight gained from long hours working with machinery. Julian looked at the complex metal block, feeling the hope of reviving his energy project, which had been dormant for so long, suddenly ignite. Meanwhile, at the fishing village, darkness enveloped the old boatyard. Cyrus Thorne sat on Elias's wooden chair, his feet propped up on the workbench. He tossed the rusty wrench onto a pile of documents. Elias stood opposite him, his face pale under the flickering flashlight. Cyrus slid a piece of paper toward the old man. "Sign this, Elias. A declaration stating that Julian Vance used money to buy you off, forcing you to surrender the child to seize her talent." "I won't sign. Julian is giving the child a better future." Future. Do you think that tycoon cares about the child? He only wants what's in her head. Sign it, and I'll give you back the boatyard. If not, my company will take over this land tomorrow. You'll be sleeping under a bridge with your scrap metal. Cyrus used his influence to shutter all of Elias's income sources. He blocked repair contracts, forcing neighbors to turn their backs on the old man. Elias looked at the paper, his hands shaking. Cyrus smiled faintly. He knew the old mechanic's weakness. He needed Elias to become a tool to publicly discredit Julian in the press, fabricating a sensational child abduction scandal. The next morning, Lyra woke up in the spacious room at the estate. She felt stifled in this luxurious glass cage. Lyra wandered back to the lab while Julian was meeting with the board of directors. She discovered an old wooden drawer tucked beneath the modern desk. Inside the drawer, there were no electronic components. Lyra found a stack of faded, yellowed photographs. In one picture, her father stood arm in arm with Julian, both covered in oil and smiling brightly in front of a crude engine schematic. Lyra gently touched the photo. Below the stack was a brass engineer's badge, her father's emblem. It was pinned prominently to an incomplete blueprint titled "Sustainable Flame." Lyra looked at the blueprint. Her father's delicate, confident lines were clear. She noticed a coupling diagram that was left unfinished. Just as Lyra reached out to touch the edge of the paper for a closer look, the building's security system suddenly blared. Red lights spun continuously on the ceiling. The lab door burst open. Julian rushed in his face, drawn the ringing phone still held to his ear. The security alarm continued its piercing blare, shaking the very air in the lab. Julian Vance quickly moved to the control panel, his finger swiping hard to cut off the entire audio system. A sudden heavy silence returned, thick and suffocating. Lyra still stood there, her small hands clutching her father's brass badge until her knuckles were white. "Those lights are just a fright. Are you all right?" Lyra didn't answer right away. She stared at the incomplete blueprint on the desk. "Uncle Julian, this photo, my father and you were very close once, weren't you?" Julian looked at the yellowed photo in Lyra's hand, his eyes softening but filled with pain. "Yes. Your father was the best associate I ever had. I owe him a future I never managed to bring to fruition." Julian moved closer to the large screen in the center of the room. He entered a complex sequence of codes, then gently opened a classified file labeled "Sustainable Flame." Intricate technical schematics appeared, casting a pale blue light that enveloped the faces of the man and the child. "This is it. The thing your father used to draw every night before the workshop perished." Lyra stepped closer, her finger trembling as she pointed to a detail in the lower corner of the thermal joints. It was a tiny, thread-thin symbol, shaped like a delicate green leaf, skillfully integrated into the diagram. "Look, Uncle. This is my father's unique way of marking a drawing. He signed the joints with this leaf to signify that everything must move with smooth continuity." Julian was stunned. He had looked at this blueprint thousands of times over the past 10 years, yet his top engineers and he himself had always considered it a meaningless decorative mark or a digital scanning error. "I always thought it was just a scratch on the original draft. For 10 years I tried to recreate it from the remnants Cyrus provided. He reported that the incident had consumed everything and only these few backups remained intact." Lyra began to trace her small fingers across the touchscreen. She zoomed in on sections of the air control diagrams. Her brows furrowed, her expression growing serious, like a seasoned mechanic diagnosing a ship about to sink. "This blueprint has a problem, Uncle Julian. Look at this diagram. The left and right sides are not symmetrical. Here, the exhaust valves are off by 3 degrees from the main shaft's rotation. If it runs at high power, the pressure will be forced to one side and could cause an incident." Julian stepped closer, carefully observing the numbers Lyra had pointed out. "My engineers said this was a design to optimize thermal flow. They were mistaken. This isn't a design flaw by my father. He would never allow such a foolish asymmetry. Someone altered these parameters. They deliberately flawed the blueprint so you would never succeed." Julian felt an electric current run down his spine. He began to piece everything together. For 10 years, he had poured billions of dollars into the initiative, but the reactor always overheated and catastrophically failed in the final stage. Cyrus Thorne hadn't just taken the boatyard. He had provided Julian with maliciously altered fraudulent data. He wanted Julian to be financially exhausted and disgraced, all while secretly holding the genuine secrets, waiting for the day he could claim a technology monopoly. The lab door opened. Marcus, Julian's assistant, entered with a thick folder in his hand. Marcus was generally a practical man and had always been skeptical of Lyra's arrival, but now his face showed extreme tension. "Mr. Vance, I just got the audit results from Cyrus Thorne's former insurance provider. You won't believe this." Marcus placed the folder on the table. Right before the boatyard incident 10 years ago, Cyrus secretly acquired a substantial volume of hidden shares in the very insurance company that would cover the incident. He didn't just receive compensation, he profited from the fire itself by manipulating the insurance stock prices. Julian ground his teeth, his hand striking the table forcefully. So that incident wasn't an accident. He ignited the fire to eliminate all evidence, take out my associate, and seize the intellectual property. All for his filthy greed. His actions were meticulous. He framed himself as Elias's benefactor by lending money, when in fact it was to trap their family and ensure no one could revisit the past. Marcus continued, his voice trembling with indignation. Julian looked at Lyra. She was clutching the brass badge, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were burning with fierce determination. Julian's long-held suspicion had turned into a brutal truth. He wasn't just conducting business, he was confronting a felon concealed as a businessman. "Marcus, prepare the legal files immediately. We will initiate a full inspection of Cyrus's old archives. I will make him pay for what he did to your parents, Lyra." "Uncle Julian, I want to retrieve the wrench. Mr. Thorne took it. My father said it was the most precious thing, more valuable than these blueprints." The conversation was cut short by the continuous flashing of blue and red lights outside the estate's large windows. The loud wail of police sirens ripped through the quiet luxury neighborhood. Marcus looked down at the lobby through the surveillance screen. City police have arrived. They are accompanied by Cyrus's legal team. They are demanding that you surrender Lyra immediately to fulfill a summons regarding guardianship protection. Cyrus is using the media to pressure the court into issuing a forced removal order. Julian looked out the window where the police vehicles were crowding the main gate. He turned to Lyra. The child who had just found hope in the truth was about to be pushed back into the den of the person who had ended her parents' lives. "We can't let them take you. If you fall into his hands now, he will eliminate the final pieces of evidence." Julian firmly took Lyra's shoulders. He looked at Marcus and signaled with a resolute gaze. "Marcus, stop them in the main lobby. Use every legal argument to delay. I need 10 minutes to take the child out the back exit." At the estate's gate, Cyrus Thorne stepped out of his vehicle. He calmly adjusted his collar, a triumphant smile on his face, as he watched the police officers begin to enter the grand hall. He held the rusty wrench high for the surrounding reporters. The heavy pounding on the door reverberated into the laboratory like hammer blows against Julian's patience. The blurred silhouettes of the police were visible on the opaque glass. Julian Vance stood guarding the only entrance, his feet apart, his back straight. He held up the emergency educational sponsorship file, sealed with a red stamp, to the leading officer. This is a legitimate protection order. The girl is participating in the corporation's talent development program. You have no authority to enforce removal. The officer ignored the file. He held out a paper with the fresh signature of a judge. The court summons supersedes that, Mr. Vance. Cyrus Thorne submitted evidence that you are abusing your power to unlawfully detain a minor against her family's wishes. Please step aside so we can perform our duties. Julian looked at the order, his eyes narrowed. Cyrus had calculated every second precisely. He knew how to use the law to tie Julian's hands in the very place he thought was safest. Below at the estate's gate, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of rain and the noise of the reporters. Cyrus stood before dozens of cameras, his hand placed falsely on Uncle Elias's shoulder. He quickly wiped a raindrop from his forehead, his face showing clear distress. All I want is to bring this unfortunate child home. A tycoon cannot simply use money to take whoever he pleases. Elias is distraught over losing his niece, and I am here to seek justice for him. Cyrus nudged Elias hard in the side. The old mechanic trembled, the paper in his hand wrinkled and soaked. Elias looked into the camera, his lips mumbling words filled with bitterness. Julian Vance. He misled me. He said he'd let the child go to school, but instead, he locked her in that room full of machines. I want Lyra back. Please return my niece to me. Behind the thick glass of the high-floor laboratory, Lyra stood motionless. She pressed her face close to the large TV screen, broadcasting the scene at the gate live. She saw the fear in her uncle's clouded eyes. Lyra understood Uncle Elias well. His trembling hands holding the paper were not from anger, but because he was being backed into a corner. Cyrus was turning her uncle's weakness into a poisoned arrow shot directly at the person trying to protect her. Julian walked closer, placing his hand on Lyra's shoulder. He didn't look at the screen, but at his own reflection in her eyes. He called Marcus over, lowering his voice to give a command. Marcus dispatched the security team secretly to the fishing village now. Surround Elias's house. Don't let any of Cyrus's people touch anything there. We need to preserve a path for him to return. Julian took his phone, connecting to his private legal office. Draft a full debt forgiveness commitment for Elias immediately. Find a secure apartment in the suburbs and prepare a car. I will give him a final choice in court. If he denies these coerced statements, he will have a new life. But things were not as easy as Julian anticipated. His phone vibrated relentlessly. Calls from the Vance Global Board of Directors poured in like a flood. Julian put the call on speaker. Angry voices rang out. Julian, the stock is plummeting drastically. This child abduction incident is destroying the corporation. You must hand the child over immediately. We don't care what you plan to do with that energy project, but the company's reputation is the top priority. Julian looked at Lyra, then at the half-running data screens. The child is the key to the truth. If I surrender her now, we lose everything, including the evidence of the incident years ago. We don't care about an incident from 10 years ago. Return the child to Thorne, or we will initiate a vote to remove you from your position. The abrupt hang-up echoed crisply. Julian stood in the center of the room, isolated within his own empire. He looked at Lyra, then sighed softly. He understood he couldn't fight both the legal system and the board of directors simultaneously without causing Lyra more distress. "We have to go out, Lyra. I regret that I couldn't keep you here any longer." Julian led Lyra down to the grand lobby. The main door of the estate was wide open. Cold wind rushed in, carrying the shouts of the crowd and the constant flashing of camera lights. Cyrus Thorne stood there triumphant. He held the rusty wrench high in the air as a lure. "Come over here, Lyra. Uncle Elias is waiting for you. Look what I have for you, your father's keepsake." Lyra saw the wrench. Unable to resist, she rushed forward. Her eyes were fixed on the item she cherished. Julian tried to grab her hand, but the police officer stepped in the way. "Let the child go, Mr. Vance. This is a lawful order." The moment Lyra touched the wrench's handle, Cyrus's smile vanished, replaced by a cruel expression. He violently snatched the item back simultaneously, gripping Lyra's wrist tightly. He roughly pulled her toward his vehicle despite her struggles. "Job done. Let's go." Julian lunged forward but was restrained by Cyrus's henchmen and the police. He watched in utter helplessness as Cyrus's vehicle sped away. Lyra pressed her face against the rear window, her tear-filled eyes looking back at Julian, who was growing smaller in the distance. Cyrus sat inside the vehicle, tossing the wrench onto the floor. He opened a leather briefcase, retrieving a small walkie-talkie. "Prepare the workshop. We're going to make the child give us that code tonight. No tycoon is coming to her rescue now." The car disappeared into the city's night. Meanwhile, Julian Vance stood in the estate's lobby, his hand clenched so tightly it was bleeding. He turned to Marcus, his voice strained. "Cancel all meetings. We are not waiting for the court date anymore. Call Elias, tell him the price for his silence is the life of his only niece." Underneath Cyrus's seat, the rusty wrench vibrated slightly. A tiny red light began to flash in the small gap Cyrus had pried open earlier. The thing he thought was a code, but was actually a tracking device Lyra's father had installed for just such an emergency. Julian suddenly received the tracker signal. "Good heavens, he is violating the stipulations. We have our opening." The signal emitted from under Cyrus's vehicle led Julian's legal team straight to the iron gate of the Thorne estate in just 2 hours. With evidence of Cyrus unilaterally violating the no-contact order during the dispute and the risk of Lyra holding national trade secrets, the court issued a temporary ruling. Lyra was permitted to return to the Vance Global Lab for 48 hours to complete a final competency test before the exhibition. Cyrus was forced to concede, but his sneering smile upon releasing Lyra suggested he had another plot. Lyra stood alone in the vast laboratory. The cold white light from the ceiling lamps reflected off the inert metal blocks. She held a screwdriver, gently turning the pressure valve of the fuel injection system. Everything here was too perfect, too sterile, but her intuition told her something was wrong. The screws on a ventilation hatch seemed to have been loosened, and the faint smell of old engine oil, the distinct aroma of Uncle Elias's boatyard, hung in the otherwise purified air. Lyra paused. She heard footsteps. Lyra turned around. Behind a towering bank of air compressors, a thin figure was trying to conceal himself. "Uncle Elias." The man stepped out of the shadows. His work clothes were dusty from the ventilation shaft. His face was ashen sweat pouring down him despite the lab's low temperature. He dared not look Lyra in the eye. "Lyra, I thought you had retired for the night. How did you get in here? This is the system maintenance path." Elias trembled, his hand gripping his shirt front. He approached the sustainable flame engine model resting on the test stand. "Cyrus, he knows the layout of this building. He ordered me to retrieve one item, just one thing, and then he promised he would leave us alone." Lyra looked at her uncle's calloused hands, which were shaking as they reached for the core speed regulator. This was the engine's heart, the most critical component controlling temperature and efficiency. If it were gone, tomorrow's exhibition would be a disaster. Are you going to take it? You know this is what my parents poured their lives into. Elias halted. He sank to his knees on the cold floor. He pulled out a shattered screen phone from his pocket, showing Lyra a message he'd received 10 minutes earlier. Bring me the core, or you will perish tomorrow, just like the boatyard did years ago. I am not joking, Elias. He will do it, Lyra. He incinerated your father's workshop. I'm terrified. I don't want to be wiped out. I'm indebted, I'm weak-willed, but I want to stay alive. Lyra looked at the message, then at her uncle, who was curled up in fear. She felt no anger, only pity. Cyrus had completely broken this man's spirit, turning him into a pathetic puppet. Lyra moved closer, taking Elias's cold hands in hers. His heart beat wildly beneath his thin skin, broadcasting his utter panic. Get up, uncle. I understand. Lyra released his hands. She walked toward the spare parts cabinet in the corner of the room. She rummaged through the discarded items and pulled out a speed regulator that looked exactly like the one mounted on the engine. But Lyra knew the difference. This one, she had secretly filed down the thermal locking pin yesterday to test its endurance limits. It would operate perfectly for the first 15 minutes, but when the temperature spiked, the pin would fracture and completely paralyze the system. Don't take the one on the machine. Julian will notice immediately if the system reports an error upon removal. Take this one instead. Elias looked up, his eyes wide with suspicion and fear. This, will it actually function? Cyrus said he needs the genuine component. It is authentic, but I adjusted the settings to make it more compatible with fishing boat fuel rather than premium-grade fuel. Take it back to him. He will be convinced. Elias took the cold metal component. He stared at Lyra, tears streaming down his worn face. He wanted to apologize, but his throat was choked with emotion. He quickly stuffed the component into his pocket, then awkwardly crawled back toward the dark maintenance shaft. In the security operations room, Julian Vance stood with his arms crossed before the surveillance screen. He had seen everything. Marcus stood beside him, his hand poised over the alarm button. Sir, he's carrying the component out. We must intercept him. Julian shook his head, his gaze fixed on the image of Lyra standing quietly in the lab. No, let him go. Lyra just gave him a ticking time bomb, not a component. If we detain Elias now, Cyrus will vehemently deny everything and pin all the blame on the poor old man. But if Cyrus installs that thing into his own machinery, he will publicly orchestrate his own downfall. You trust the child that much, sir? That's an immense risk. I don't rely on risk. I rely on the daughter of my former associate. In the lab, just as Elias's silhouette disappeared completely behind the maintenance hatch, Lyra bent down to pick up something her uncle had dropped, or perhaps intentionally left behind. It was the rusty wrench. Cyrus had given it to Elias to use to open the machine, and now it had returned to her. Lyra held the familiar item. The rough feel of the rust reassured her, but as her thumb ran along the wrench's body, she stopped. A thin crack ran along the handle. This fissure was not natural. It was straight and sharp, as if cut by a laser, unlike a break caused by impact or age. Lyra brought the wrench close to her eye, squinting to examine the tiny gap that had opened. Inside the dark crack, she saw a faint green glow of an electronic circuit board, something that should never appear inside a solid block of steel used for boat maintenance. Lyra's heart pounded. She realized this was not merely a tool. Her father hadn't just left a memento. He had left a key, and Cyrus Thorne, in his frenzied pursuit of complex blueprints, had foolishly handed Pandora's box back to the only person who knew how to open it. Would Uncle Elias's betrayal lead to disaster, or was it a concealed tactic Click to follow the final developments with us to uncover the real secret, conclusion for the antagonists. Lyra stood motionless in the silent laboratory, her small hands trembling as she clutched her father's keepsake. The gap along the rusty steel body radiated a strange warmth. She quickly took a small metal rod and skillfully leveraged it into the crack. The handle section, which was presumed to be solid cast, unexpectedly slid open. Lyra held her breath as the inside revealed a small compartment lined with black shock-absorbing rubber. From the gap, a microscopic memory chip fell out, resting perfectly in her palm. Accompanied by it was a small folded piece of paper, so old that the paper color had turned yellow. Lyra unfolded the note with shaking fingers. For Lyra, the key to the truth. Her father's handwriting, the bold, compassionate strokes, made Lyra's chest tighten. She immediately rushed to the central computer console. "Uncle Julian, look at this. My father hid it here for 10 years. Julian Vance rushed over his face, transforming, as he saw the memory chip in Lyra's hand. He quickly connected it to the data port. The large laboratory screen abruptly changed. Real-time engine pressure graphs, the data Julian had so desperately sought, appeared densely on the display. This wasn't the edited blueprint Cyrus had provided. This was the perfect original blueprint of the sustainable flame. Your father, he hid the soul of the initiative in the very tool he held every day. Cyrus Thorne possessed this wrench, but he was too consumed by greed to grasp its true value. As Julian finished speaking, an audio file automatically activated. The lab speakers emitted static, then a voice. It was Lyra's father's voice, calm but full of resolve. "I will not sell you this algorithm, Cyrus. It is not a military asset. It is a solution for the struggling people in this coastal region." Immediately after, Cyrus Thorne's exasperated voice followed. His tone was strained, carrying a clear threat. "Who do you think you are? I've invested in this decrepit shop for far too long. If you don't give me the fuel-saving algorithm, I will burn this entire place to the ground. I won't let you take that secret anywhere." Julian Vance stood silently behind Lyra. His entire body was rigid. The fragments of the incident 10 years prior flooded back cruelly clear. Cyrus Thorne wasn't just a thief. He was the one who ignited the destruction that ended his associate's life simply because he couldn't possess their goodwill. So it wasn't an accident. I have been blaming myself for 10 years for arriving too late, but in reality, the perpetrator was already there. Lyra looked at the screen, tears welling up, but she didn't sob. The 9-year-old's eyes flared with fierce determination. She turned to Julian, her small hand clutching his coat. "We have to make that man face the consequences, Uncle Julian. You promised me you would find justice for my parents." "We will do more than that, Lyra. I won't let your father's name be disgraced by his inferior products." Julian immediately ordered the system to back up the data onto a multitude of different drives. He looked over at Marcus, who had just entered, with an urgent expression. "Mr. Vance Cyrus Thorne has left. His convoy is heading for the National Convention Center. He is certain that the component Elias just delivered is the final piece for him to complete the project on stage. He wants to put on a show. We will give him the most shocking conclusion." Julian turned back to Lyra. "Are you prepared? We are going to alter the entire command sequence for the live exhibition. The machine he brings will be the definitive proof of his deception." Lyra nodded decisively. She sat down at the keyboard, her hands flying over the lines of code. She was no longer the frightened child from the fishing dock. She was the daughter of a mechanical genius reclaiming her family's legacy. "I will allow his machine to run smoothly for the first few minutes. Let him smile broadly for everyone. Then I will cut the thermal flow." "Where did you learn this method?" Father said the arrogant often take the biggest fall when they believe they have reached the very top. Julian smiled a rare yet authoritative smile. He walked to the storage cabinet, retrieving a small technician's uniform he had ready for Lyra. She put on the specialized gear, tucking the memory chip into her breast pocket, close to her rapidly beating heart. Cyrus Thorne, at that moment, was sitting in his luxury car, looking at the core speed regulator in his hand, completely unaware that it was the defective gift Lyra had prepared. He smiled triumphantly, dreaming of lucrative military contracts and absolute authority. Julian Vance will lose everything tonight. His reputation, his company, and that small asset he's been shielding. Julian's convoy also began to move. Lyra sat next to Julian, watching the city lights blaze through the window. She felt the weight of the memory chip in her pocket. It wasn't just data, it was justice, pain, and hope. Uncle Julian, what if we are unsuccessful? We will not be unsuccessful, Lyra. The truth is already in our hands. All that remains is for the world to witness it. The SUV stopped in front of the convention center gate. The stage lights were brilliant against the night sky. The crowd of investors and reporters packed the entrance. Julian Vance stepped out, adjusted his collar, and offered his hand to Lyra. "Let's go. Your father is watching us." Lyra walked beside Julian, her small figure resolute amidst the throngs of people. She saw Cyrus Thorne standing in the center of the grand lobby, holding a microphone, preparing to walk onto the stage to announce his great invention. Vite qui fera. Cyrus Thorne ascended the platform to resounding applause. He glanced toward the entrance, a smirk appearing when he saw Julian Vance and Lyra approaching. Cyrus placed his hand on the ignition button of the demonstration engine, but he didn't notice Lyra secretly putting her hand into her pocket, gently touching the memory chip, and a small transceiver in her hand began to blink with a blue light, fully synchronizing with the entire auditorium server system. Backstage, Marcus received a signal from the security team. He gave a slight nod to Julian, but his eyes remained fixed on the eastern exit where strange figures were moving. Julian didn't pay attention to that at the moment. He placed his hand on Lyra's shoulder, feeling her tension through the technician's jacket. On the stage, the spotlight shone directly on Cyrus Thorne. He stood there, arms wide open, as if to embrace the adoration of the thousands of spectators below. Behind him was the highly polished, sustainable flame engine model with the Thorne Industries label pasted over the original technical markings. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I haven't brought a machine. I have brought a revolution, clean energy, high efficiency, and entirely owned by Thorne Industries." Cyrus walked closer to the machine stand. He pulled the core speed regulator, the item he believed was the final key stolen by Elias, from his pocket. He installed it into the central opening with feigned expertise, then pressed the ignition button. Witness the future in action. Lyra stood in the shadows, quietly counting down. She knew exactly what was about to happen. That speed regulator could only withstand the heat for precisely 60 seconds. The engine began to turn. The initial smooth hum drew murmurs of admiration from the crowd. Cyrus smiled triumphantly, adjusting his tie, his eyes glancing at the investors who were nodding with satisfaction. But that smile lasted only 45 seconds. A sudden, ear-splitting shriek emanated from the main shaft. The machine began to shake violently. Unsecured bolts sprang up, hitting the protective glass casing with a terrifying clatter. "What is happening?" Cyrus turned around, the smile frozen on his face. He frantically hit the control panel to reduce the power, but the system was locked at maximum output due to the code Lyra had set. White smoke from the cooling system began to billow, enveloping the stage in a suffocating chemical odor. "It's just a minor technical glitch. The cooling system is adjusting," Cyrus shouted into the microphone, but the roar of the overloaded engine drowned out his shaking voice. The audience began to panic, those in the front rows hastily retreating, fearing a dangerous incident. Just then, Julian Vance emerged from the shadows. He did not run. He did not shout. He walked calmly to the master control board. With a decisive move, he flipped the safety breaker, cutting all power to the engine. The massive machine shuddered one last time and fell silent, leaving behind a plume of white smoke and a chilling silence. This is not a technical glitch, Cyrus. This is the consequence of trying to operate something you fundamentally don't understand. Julian took the memory chip from Lyra's hand, plugging it straight into the connection port of the massive LED screen behind the stage. You claim this is your invention. Allow its true creator to speak. The screen flashed. The original blueprint appeared with the characteristic leaf-shaped sketches at the joints, a detail completely absent from Cyrus's smoking machine. Immediately, the audio recording from 10 years prior played clearly audible over the auditorium's high-powered speakers. If you don't give me the algorithm, I will burn this entire place to the ground. I won't let you take that secret anywhere. Cyrus's spiteful voice reverberated throughout the hall. The crowd was stunned. The investors who had just applauded now looked at Cyrus with disgust. Reporters simultaneously aimed their lenses at him, flashes popping like condemning lightning. Cyrus backed up, bumping into the hot machine stand. He looked around for an escape, but the exits were blocked by people in court security uniforms and economic crimes investigators. No, this is a setup. Julian Vance is attempting to sabotage me. That tape is fabricated. Blueprints don't conceal problems, and a mechanic's conscience doesn't either. Julian led Lyra forward. She stood opposite Cyrus, who was now hunched over, sweat running off his face, washing away his glamorous makeup. Lyra showed no fear. She slowly pulled the rusty wrench from her technician's jacket pocket. You sought this for 10 years. You caused a tragic loss. You intimidated Uncle Elias. You did everything just to possess it, but you never truly looked at it. Lyra held the wrench high. Under the stage lights, the crack where the chip was hidden was clearly visible to everyone. It is not just a tool for repair. It is evidence, and now it belongs to the authorities. The police chief walked onto the stage. Lyra respectfully placed the wrench in his hand. Simultaneously, 2 other officers approached, reading Cyrus Thorne, his rights for commercial fraud security violations, and suspected involvement in the deliberate tragic incident. Cyrus was placed in restraints. He struggled, shouting meaningless threats toward Julian and Lyra as he was escorted away between 2 rows of officers. The crowd's jeers echoed throughout the hall. The shareholders who had supported him now turned their backs and walked away, leaving him alone with the collapse of the fabricated empire he had painstakingly built. Julian knelt down, meeting Lyra's eye level. He used his handkerchief to wipe a streak of oil from her cheek, the smudge she got when intentionally disabling the speed regulator just moments ago. You did remarkably well. Your parents would be incredibly proud. We succeeded, didn't we, Uncle? We succeeded, Lyra. Cyrus will never pose a risk to anyone again. 3 months. That was enough time for wounds to begin mending, but also long enough to completely change the appearance of a coastal region. The Pinewood fishing village no longer had the burned scent of exhaust or the desolate look of moored, failing ships. This morning, bright yellow sunshine streamed onto the newly reinforced wooden pier. Blue banners fluttered in the sea breeze, bearing the words, "Vance Community Initiative, a new beginning." Julian Vance stood at the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets, breathing in the salty air. He looked at the crowd gathered below. No longer the strained faces anxious with debt, as they were the first day he arrived with his black convoy. Today they were laughing the sun-tanned fishermen, eagerly anticipating the miracle they once thought impossible. Marcus approached Julian, handing him a slim folder. "Everything is settled, sir. The venture capital group backing Cyrus has completely pulled out. After we threatened to publicly disclose their money laundering list to the Securities Commission, they opted to clear Elias's debt in exchange for our silence." "Excellent. I don't want any shadows of the past tainting this day." Julian took the folder and turned around. Elias stood there neat in a clean white shirt and trousers. The old uncle no longer had the hunched, fearful look of a hunted animal. His eyes, though still lined with the marks of time, had regained their sharp, self-respecting gaze. Lyra stood beside her uncle. She wore a pale blue dress, but her shoes were still practical, rubber-soled athletic shoes for working in the shop. She looked at Julian, then at Uncle Elias, her eyes showing a slight hesitation. "Uncle Elias, are you sure about this?" Elias smiled the most relaxed smile Lyra had ever seen. He took the pen, looking at the guardianship transfer document on the table. "Lyra, I am not signing this because I want to push you away. I'm signing it because you belong to a sky much broader than my rusty sheet metal roof. Julian, he can give you the wings I could never afford." Elias signed his name decisively on the final line. He capped the pen, pushing the paper toward Julian. "Take good care of her, Vance, not as an asset, but as a daughter." Julian took the paper, but he didn't put it away immediately. He pulled a blue lanyard ID badge from his breast pocket. "I promise, Elias, and I have an offer for you as well. I can't have a mechanic with 40 years of experience sitting idle. Beat that boatyard." Julian placed the badge around Elias's neck. It read, "Manager of Community Technical Training Workshop. I acquired the entire Thorn Boatyard property after his assets were seized. I'm turning it into a free training center for the children of the fishermen here. I need a manager who knows every bolt and nut of these fishing boats. Are you up to the task?" Elias was stunned. He held the badge, his hand trembling, not from fear, but from profound emotion. He wasn't being discarded. He was being given back his working dignity. I will do it. I will teach the children how to listen to machines just like Lyra does." A voice over the loudspeaker invited everyone to gather toward the temporary stage at the end of the pier. The time had come. Lyra stepped onto the speaking platform. She had to stand on a small wooden crate to reach above the microphone. Hundreds of camera lenses in the eyes of the townsfolk focused on her. Lyra was no longer shaking like she was the stormy night she worked on Julian's car. She placed a small black hard drive on the table, the container for the complete perfect algorithm of the sustainable flame engine. Lyra cleared her throat, her clear voice ringing out above the lapping waves. "My name is Lyra. Everyone here knew my parents. They were the engineers who lived and perished in this fishing village." The crowd fell into an absolute silence. For 10 years, people fought over what's inside this hard drive. They caused a tragic loss. They deceived. They did terrible things just to keep it for themselves, to sell it for an exorbitant amount. Mr. Cyrus Thorne wanted to use it to control everyone, but my father didn't design it to enrich one person. Lyra looked down at the front row, where Julian nodded encouragingly. This engine was created to help boats travel farther, use less fuel, so the uncles and aunts here wouldn't have to worry every time gas prices increased. So today, Julian and I have made a decision. Lyra held the hard drive up high. "We are not selling it. We are gifting it." Whispers began to spread. An economic reporter from the city hastily raised a hand, interrupting the child impolitely. Hold on, kid, what do you mean, Julian Vance? Are you planning to release billions of dollars worth of technology for free? What will your shareholders think? Julian stepped up, standing beside Lyra. He took the microphone, his voice deep yet commanding. Open source. Starting at noon today, the entire design and algorithm for the sustainable flame will be uploaded to the public network. Any machine shop, any fisherman has the right to download, modify, and apply it to their vessel without paying a single cent in royalties. But you are literally throwing money away, the reporter shouted. No, I'm investing in people. Julian countered, his eyes sweeping across the crowd of hard-working fishermen. Technology kept in a strongbox is just dead paper. Technology in the hands of working people is what creates life. This is Lyra's parents' legacy, and it belongs to this place. The applause started sparsely, then erupted into a roar of approval. The fishermen cheered, hugging each other. The women wiped away tears. They understood that the burden of making ends meet, which had weighed on them for so many years, was about to be lifted. Now, Lyra said loudly into the microphone, a radiant smile on her face. Do you want to hear it sing? She signaled toward the dock. Elias, from his commanding position below, waved a flag. 12 old fishing boats, the first ones to be test-fitted with the new engine over the past 3 months, started up simultaneously. There was no jarring bang-bang sound. No thick column of black smoke rose to obscure the sky. Instead, there was a low, warm ooh-ooh-hoo sound, steady and powerful. The engine sound vibrated like the breath of a massive yet gentle sea creature. The water surface rippled lightly as the boats cut through the waves, performing a demonstration loop around the bay. Lyra closed her eyes, listening to that symphony. It was the sound her parents had dreamed of. No more congestion, no more thermal overload. Everything ran smoothly, perfectly. Julian leaned down, patting Lyra's shoulder gently. You did it. Your father is smiling now. We did it, Uncle Julian. You helped me perfect the cooling system after all. That was just the hardware. You are the soul of it. Julian pulled a small blue velvet-wrapped gift box from his coat pocket. He knelt on one knee to meet Lyra's eye level, a gesture as formal as a knight presenting a treasured sword. Your old wrench, it has completed its historical mission. The authorities need to keep it as evidence, but a chief engineer can't work empty-handed. Lyra opened the gift box. Inside, resting on white silk, was a beautiful wrench. It wasn't made of rough black steel, but shone with a soft silver hue. Titanium, Julian explained, the alloy used for spacecraft. Super light, extremely durable, will never rust despite the salt water or acid. Lyra picked up the wrench. It felt weightless in her hand, perfectly balanced. She flipped the back of the handle over. Engraved there with exquisite laser precision were 3 names in a row: Arthur, Sarah, Lyra. And below that was a small inscription: to fix the world one bolt at a time. Lyra bit her lip to hold back tears. She hugged Julian tightly. For the first time in years, she felt the embrace of a parental figure, steady and secure. Julian gently squeezed her shoulder, looking over her shoulder toward Elias directing the fleet and toward the children running on the clean pier. Thank you, Lyra whispered. Let's go. Julian stood up, taking her hand. We have much work ahead. I hear the generator at the school in the next town is experiencing some issues. I bet it's just a clogged air filter. Lyra wiped her tears, her mischievous smile returning. She spun the titanium wrench lightly on her finger. The man and the child walked along the pier, heading toward the waiting car to return to the city. Behind them, the sun was rising high, shining down on the sparkling sea. The fishing boats began to head out to the open sea, leaving behind white wakes and clean air. No more shadow of Cyrus Thorne. No more worry about making ends meet, crushing dreams. only the hum of the engine telling a story of kindness, truth, and a flame of passion that would burn forever, as sustainable as the love that had bound these strangers into a family. Lyra looked back at the fishing village one last time. She knew she would return here many more times, not to escape, but to build. "Ready, Chief Engineer." Julian opened the car door. "Always ready, boss," Lyra replied, clutching the titanium wrench and stepping into her future. Note: this story is entirely fictional. The names of the characters, places, and events have been created for the purpose of illustrating an educational and artistic message. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is purely coincidental.